November 3rd here in southern Ontario, Canada. So as the Emergencies Act inquiry progresses, there are names that you may be familiar with coming into the headlines again, so to speak. Names such as Tamara Litch, Chris Barber, Tom Marazzo, Freedom George. I'm sorry, George, I don't know your last name. Now, these individuals have been touted all along as the leaders of the convoy. They never claimed to be leaders. They were drafted, in essence, by dint of their own personal competencies and gratefully accepted by participants of the Freedom Convoy and some 10 million odd American Canadians or more as spokespersons. And that's what they refer to themselves to as well. Now, Litch, Marazzo, Barber, etc. were branded by the Trudeau regime as leaders of a small fringe minority of far right-wing, misogynistic, racist, foreign-funded terrorists who held unacceptable views. Trudeau's words, and his minions in his party, the former Liberal Party, now the Trudeau Party. Anyways, the propaganda department of Trudeau's regime, the mainstream media, or legacy media if you prefer, of course dutifully parroted this misnomer, calling them leaders. Now, some 9 or 10 months later, there's little point in trying to change the brand, so to speak. It's stuck. No, in part, it's unfortunate for Miss Lish, Miss Barber, Mr. Barber, Chris, etc., to have been branded with this misnomer as they are and will continue to be prosecuted and persecuted by Trudeau's regime. None of their court hearings have been finalized. They've all been charged with mischief and encouraging mischief. They can't even speak in public or on social media to this day, although they are speaking at the inquiry. Now, a great many of the participants, supporters, and those who donated the more than $10 million that was raised not once but twice, and a great many, in fact, who traveled to Ottawa in January and February and were protesting across this country before and since January and February, had never at the time heard of Tamara, Chris, George, Tom, etc. They didn't know who these people were, and yet they were rallying behind what we had hoped would be stopping the government in its persistence of what we politely called government overreach. Now, it was not until the propaganda parrots at the legacy media started chirping these individual names that the majority of Canadians who compromised Trudeau's small fringe majority had ever even heard these individuals' names. I know I'm beleaguering that point. Trudeau was not ungrateful to the legacy media, granting millions of taxpayers' dollars in bonuses to the mainstream media's executives and employees for their coverage of events in Ottawa and over the last 2.5 years, of course. And in summation, I would just like to say Trudeau and his minions are still chirping about the Nazi flags. Trudeau said it is unacceptable in my country and to Canadians as a whole to have Nazi flags flying in the nation's capital. It is fact there were 2 Nazi flags in Ottawa in the very early days of the protest. One was carried by a protester on the ground in Ottawa. He was an elderly gentleman from an who had immigrated from an Eastern European country, and he had sort of put a Nazi symbol on the Canadian flag, and what he was trying to say was Canada is becoming a Nazi country. And the people on the ground, the fellow protesters, quickly pulled him aside and said, dude, that could be misconstrued. I mean, we understand what you're trying to say, but we don't think this is a good idea. And he readily said, and there's footage of this transpiring, he said, well, you're right. You know, I guess this wasn't the greatest of ideas. And they said, well, we understand what you're trying to say, but the mainstream media is going to run with this one, dude. And he said, yeah, okay. And he put the flag in the garbage can right there at that time on the side of the street. Again, there's footage of it. The other flag was a Nazi flag, and it's full. And it was hanging on a balcony in an area that is not open to public access. It was closed off by the parliamentary police. The public has no access to that balcony. And who was seen in the vicinity, the only individual seen in the vicinity of that flag as it briefly hung from that publicly inaccessible balcony, was Trudeau's personal photographer. Yeah, his personal photographer. There's your narcissistic sociopathy for you. But to this day, Trudeau and his minions in the former Liberal Party of Canada keep harping on about the Nazi flags that were flying in our nation's capital. Yeah. So, that's that for that vid.